Hello everyone, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Georgios Varoutsos. I am a PhD student in music focused in sonic arts at the Sonic Arts Research Centre at Queen's University Belfast in Northern Ireland. Today I'll be talking to you about some research I did during my master's called the Peace Wall Belfast, Spatial Audio Representation of Divided Spaces and Soundwalks. I'll be going through a bit of the background information of why I got into this research, and what that led me to do was 2 audio projects, as well as a paper describing the research and concepts used to complete it. I'll also show some examples, so you will need some headphones to listen to it properly in high quality. And then I'll talk about the results and conclusion where we're looking forward with this research. I initially became interested in this topic back in 2016 when I first visited Northern Ireland. I took a tour that went past the Peace Wall, and not knowing too much about it, I wanted to do further research to figure out why it was a divided space, what was either side's view, and what were the discussions really about of what happened and what was to change. There's a lot of interesting factors with the Peace Wall and the ideologies in Northern Ireland because much of the social aspects are divided, such as having this doubling up concept, which means both sides will have the same facilities but only for the local communities, such as a sports center or other services. So when we're looking at the Peace Wall from this angle, to the left would be the nationalist Republican community, and to the right of the Peace Wall would be the unionist or loyalist community. From different angles, you could see that some houses are actually right against the wall, and this wall will stretch further to the left and the right, which has gates in between it as well. These gates are mostly controlled or opened by local community members or business owners. However, there is another gate that's controlled by the police. This photo is showing you the quickest route to circle around the wall, this particular part of the wall, which does pass through 2 of the gates. To the left would be the one controlled by the police, and to the right would be the local community member or business owner that would open and close it actually every single day of the week. Northern Ireland has a long-standing division between political ideologies and community groups. As I've mentioned before, we have on one hand the Republican nationalists that want to remain with a united Ireland, and the other group being the unionists or the loyalists who want to remain with the United Kingdom. Approaching 1969, this feud and tension rose into a civil rights movement, where there began to have a lot of riots, violence, and even death. What began to happen is both sets of communities were putting up their own man-made barriers, and this was a form of protection for their own communities and people while tension and violence were rising. The local Northern Ireland government and the British Army decided to step in to put up what they called temporary measures, or the Peace Wall, to defuse the situation in order to have conflict resolution, to discuss the scenario and circumstances that everyone was in. However, in our present day, these walls still remain, making them last longer than the Berlin Wall. In 2015, a research was done by the Belfast Interface Project, where they want to calculate how many of these kind of defensive architectures were still around. There's approximately 115 in Northern Ireland, 90 of them being in Belfast. Now, a defensive architecture does not have to be a peace wall. It can be a gate or a smaller version of a wall, as long as it's a divider between the communities. Now, the Peace Wall is visually striking, representing a large amount of visual information. What I want to do with my research was remove this visual stimuli and represent the sonic or audio elements that are within the spaces themselves. What I mean by this is the audio perspective of information that's being transferred over, under, or through the wall, what type of elements are being generated on both sets of communities, so within their spaces, and trying to find new relationships to maybe connect either side. I use two forms of audio technologies, all coming from spatial audio, one being with ambisonics, and the other being binaural Soundwalks. And I'll get into this. Now, with spatial audio, what we're trying to do is capture the 360 audio information of the space. Picture a sonic bubble of some sort, and that information is representing all angles of audio information. What's very interesting with ambisonics is not only the recording process, but the way that you can decode this information for different playbacks. Meaning, once you have a ambisonics file, you can decode it down into different playback systems. So low playback systems such as stereo, headphones, speakers, or bringing that up to 5.1, 7.1, or even higher speaker amounts. And this allows us to retain the information and represent it for a proper playback system. The difference between ambisonics and binaural is the representation of the space and the person or perspective listening into it. Binaural places you in that space with the information traveling around you because you're listening to it through headphones. Whereas ambisonics is allowing a larger amount of people to be able to experience a audio space. So, in the portion of the Soundwalks, I did use binaural audio. So we have a dual concept here. Binaural is still retaining spatial information, but being played back through headphones. So you'll still be able to hear sounds moving across from you, around you, whereas a Soundwalk is done with no technology at all. It takes different forms and can be represented in different ways. But the core concept of a Soundwalk is the active listening of a space. This is brought on by R. Murray Schafer and then others who have worked on the World Soundscape projects such as Hildegard Westerkamp and Barry Chaux. What we're doing is moving from the aspect of hearing and transitioning into a space of listening. So we could be in spaces time and time again, not paying attention to the sonic elements within that space. And that's what a Soundwalk is doing. It's heightening that experience. We're trying to focus in on the acoustic properties or the sonic identifiers of that space. So by combining the binaural recordings into a Soundwalk experience, it's creating a new experiences in the space themselves when listening back to them. Now, the research that helped me create my audio projects is across different disciplines. I'm trying to fashion in forms of sonification, which I initially want to do RGB data sonification. So sonification means taking data and transforming it into sound. And RGB sonification would be red, green, and blue for images, giving a numerical value that you can then associate with a sound. However, I saw this as a misrepresentation of the space, and that is why I switched into physical sonification, picking up vibrations using a contact microphone to represent some of the objects found on the wall and within the community spaces. There's also the aspect of recording a space to represent the cultural story. Gallagher and his research showcased how to reignite a space by using different forms of recording in order to better associate with sound markers. And what I mean by this is a sound that is unique or creates a marker in that space that you could identify that space by its sound. Now, my primary tool to create my research projects was field recording. This meant recording across the year with different types of devices in order to create a sound library that would represent the space. But I also wanted to interview people in order to get the narrative and dialogue surrounding the Peace Wall, kind of the discussions about the presence, perhaps even history, and what people were saying for the future of these Peace Walls. Some other kind of sources of audio material that I was able to get access was through the BBC Northern Ireland archives. I was able to grab some footage and use that to create a time frame of the past of what people were saying, and then use my own recordings to interrelate both of those kind of discussions and points that were raised at different times. I use the different microphones as well to capture the kind of abstract sounds that we don't really pay attention to or that we can't actually hear. So like I mentioned before, the sonification aspect allowed me to do that with the contact microphone. I also used a coil microphone that picks up electromagnetic fields. So this is with anything to do with like the generators in the community spaces. And then I'm able to creatively use them to represent the different informations, as I've mentioned, with sounds that are traveling above and around and through the wall. At this portion of the presentation, I would recommend that you have your headphones on, since I'll play audio, discuss, play the second audio, and then discuss. What you listened to was a short clip from Divided Spaces. This project is conceptually founded on the aspects of ambisonics, bringing back this idea that ambisonics can create these kind of 360 spaces and capturing kind of the sonic bubble of a physical space. What I did was record across a year and then stitch these bubbles together to create a version that would remove the Peace Wall itself and position the listener in its place, giving you the opportunity to listen to both sides of the community simultaneously. Not only that, by intertwining the BBC archive material, I was able to create a time frame or timeline of discussions that were said back in 1969 all the way up to my own material that was done in 2020. What I want to do was take a large physical space and be able to reintroduce it to the community to show how we can actually listen to each other. Because I also anonymize all the information pertaining to names and associations to communities. Therefore, the information that's being represented is discussing how either both sides are blaming or both sides are looking for a resolution. Now, what you listened to was a short clip from one of the 6 soundscapes I generated for the Peace Wall Belfast Soundwalks. These projects particularly focus on different avenues of sound, but they want to identify the spaces, either through abstract sounds or sonic markers, such as the ice cream truck, that would be part of the community, or even how some of the community children use the Peace Wall as their own playground. An interesting sound that I was able to record for this project was one day I was on one side of the wall hearing a drummer on the other side. By gathering up my equipment, I was able to run across and record that same drummer. So it's the first time that you get this dual perception of a sound on both sides of the wall. After demonstrating both of these projects, where I had mixed participants, some being local and some international, we were able to discuss their experiences. With divided spaces, it allowed an opportunity to walk about the audio spaces of both communities, finding things that actually relate or connect both sets of communities. With the interviews that were anonymized, it also allowed the participants to take a step back and actually listen to what the people were saying and see the connection between what was said in the past and how it's still relevant to today. Where there are moments where people are blaming one another, and there are moments that people want to find resolution with one another. For the binaural soundwalks, the participants were informed about the different types of audio information within these spaces. Some of it being the audio markers, things that people wouldn't have noticed because they would take a passerby approach, not actively listening to the space. So the recordings allowed this sort of new experience within the spaces of the Peace Wall. An interesting factor of the binaural soundwalks, when I did the demonstration, thankfully I had already taken the photos, but the Peace Walls get updated from community organizations and community members. But that information was never released when that would happen. So when I did the demonstration with the participants, they were actually updating the wall. So a lot of the things I recorded, so spaces or gaps in between the wall, or particular murals where I would rub against the paint, these types of items and interesting acoustic properties were removed or being updated and changed. So it's a very constrained period of recording, since things do change and get updated. To conclude this research, I wanted to bring up a new platform or way of experiencing the Peace Wall in order to promote conflict resolution, giving a new way of discussing the problems that have already occurred and figuring out ways of actually connecting on different forms of information. However, during COVID-19, there were riots that occurred at the Peace Wall, so my research would need updating as to what people are thinking about the Peace Walls these days, thinking about the protection and level of security that they have by having them present. I'd like to thank you very much for your time and listening to me speak today.